The morning sun glinted off the rippling surface of Lake Silverpine like shards of broken glass, promising yet another idyllic day for three longtime fishing companions. Carter Mills, a weathered ex-Marine turned wilderness guide, Jimmy Axe Pollard, a lumberjack with arms thick as tree trunks, and Marco Sanchez, a quiet accountant who found solace in the lake's crystal depths. By dawn, they had already loaded their gear into Carter's gold-flaked aluminum fishing boat, each carrying heavy packs of gear, rods, tackle boxes stuffed with lures, a large cooler of bait fish, and enough provisions to last a week on the lake. Their destination was a remote tributary, Raven's Fork, a ghostly river that trickled into the northern arm of Silverpine. They'd heard rumors that a massive bronze hue trout, nicknamed Old Ghoul, lurked in those dark, shadowed pools. Last year, Jimmy had lost his favorite rod to a powerful fish with astonishing sinew. This trip was his chance at redemption. Carter piloted the boat with the practiced ease of 20 summers, guiding anglers along Silverpine's tributaries, and Marco, perched in the bow with binoculars, scanned for waterfowl and eagles. The haze of morning mist curled above the water like phantoms, and in the distance, towering pines rose up the mountain slopes, their tips brushed with the first pink of sunrise. By mid-morning, they reached the mouth of Raven's Fork, a narrow channel spanned by arching hemlocks. Carter cut the engine and loaded the boat's anchor. The river beyond churned with unexpected vigor. Snowmelt from the high peaks, released suddenly by a late winter warm snap, had swelled the tributary's banks. Tangles of driftwood and uprooted saplings floated by like flotsam in a turbulent sea. The smooth, placid lake had given way to swirling currents and eddies that threatened to lie in wait for any angler who dared the shoals. Yet the men, confident in their local knowledge, disembarked. Carter shouldered his waders, pulled on his chest-high hip boots, and tested the water with practiced caution. Jimmy followed, grunting beneath a pack weighted with gear, and Marco trailed last, his city-bred lungs gasping at the cold, oxygen-rich mountain air. They eased into the current, jostled by swirling water that sloshed against the shore's boulders. Rain had fallen the night before, loosening small rock slides along steep banks. Carter pointed to a wide eddy on the river's far side, where he believed Old Ghoul lurked near submerged logjam. "He'll be cruising behind that downed cedar," Carter murmured. "Keep your lines tight, lads." The water, icy as mountain glass, fed through the men's waders, numbing calves and knees. Jimmy shivered and peered across the current, finger on a silver spinner. Marco eyed the drifting logs warily, remembering the cautionary words Carter had given. If anything goes wrong, grab a root or a rock. Don't try to fight the current. They fanned out in a semicircle, casting lures into swirling pools. The current grumbled and roared like an ancient beast, carrying clouds of silt downstream. Every half hour, Carter called out to his friends, "Line in!" as he reeled in waterlogged bait, their rods bent in arcs against unseen force, tugs hinting at fish below. By noon, sun pierced the mist, but the river's roar only seemed louder, as though the stormy gray had concentrated energy into each cresting wave. Suddenly, Marco's line snapped taut. He gasped and yanked back, rods straining against what felt like a submerged truck. He reeled frantically, but the unseen fish surged upstream, dragging his line through swirling foam. Carter and Jimmy hurried to him, fear flashing in their eyes as Marco struggled to maintain footing on a slippery rock. "Pull him in, Carter!" Jimmy shouted, bracing himself against the current. Carter lunged forward, took the rod butt, and helped Marco wrest the trout from the depths. For a heart-stopping moment, the battle raged beneath the surface, a spray of whitewater as the trout fought to escape. Finally, with one sharp jerk, Carter hoisted a massive bronze trout from the water, its sides glistening in the sunlight, tail thrashing like a piston. Marco's eyes widened in triumph. "Holy," he whispered, voice lost in the roar, as Carter clamped an oversized net beneath the fish. The creature, nearly 3 feet long, yielded with a final shudder, allowing Carter to lift it onto the bank. Marco cheered, eyes shining with awe. Jimmy slapped Marco on the back with such force that his gloves flew into the river. In seconds, Carter wrestled the trophy trout into the cooler for safe transport. As they celebrated, a low, ominous swell rippled upstream, much stronger than before. The river's water level, already high, rose in a slow but inexorable swell, water seeping over submerged banks and cutting new channels through gravel bars. The men traded nervous glances. "We should head back," Carter warned. "The snowmelt's gathering more in the upper basin. Not good." But Jimmy, flushed with adrenaline, insisted on one more cast. "Just one more glimpse of old Ghoul," he called. Already wading back to deeper water, Carter shook his head in resignation, following close behind to help Jimmy avoid submerged obstacles. Marco, however, felt uneasy and remained on the near bank, repacking the cooler and hoisting it into the boat. The current curled around his hip boots, tugging at his waist as if urging him to step into deeper water. He glanced upstream. Half a mile above, the sky had blackened with heavy cloud bands, and the faint rumble of distant thunder echoed off the narrow canyon walls. His heart pounded as he realized the storm was moving fast, threatening to engulf them. Before he could warn the others, a massive roar boomed from high above, so sudden and violent that the entire river seemed to reverse for a heartbeat. Jimmy's shout of alarm rang out as he lost his balance, plunging headfirst into the turbulent water. Carter, nearly in midcast, reacted instantly. He lunged toward Jimmy, snagging his forearm as the current threatened to whisk him downstream. For a moment, Carter's boots slid on slippery rocks, and his grip trembled under the force of the water. Marco dropped the cooler and leaped to help, grabbing Carter's other hand. Together, they heaved Jimmy upward, heaving him to a shallower shelf where he collapsed, lungs heaving, coughing icy water. Carter pulled Jimmy's waders higher, cutting away oversaturated straps to release the freezing pressure. Marco guided Jimmy toward the boat, helping him climb in as Carter dropped his line and attempted to restart the engine. But as the motor sputtered to life, the boat lurched unexpectedly, caught in a sudden surge that sent waves crashing over its gunnels. "Hold on!" Carter yelled, gripping the steering wheel as though it were a lifeline. The river, already swollen, had become a raging torrent that bore down on them with relentless force. Water roared past them, churning around rocky outcroppings like boiling cauldrons. Carter yanked the rudder to head downstream, seeking calmer water. But the current dragged the boat toward a half-submerged tree jam, where the trunk ferried eddies so strong they could capsize them in an instant. He fought the wheel, cutting the engine as he realized the only way to avoid a deadly collision was to coast backward, letting the current steer them away from the log jam. The boat shuddered as the propeller shopped through icy water. Carter locked the rudder, muttering a prayer. In a matter of seconds, the bow swung wide of the jam, and they drifted into a narrow eddy behind a small island of hemlocks and alders that temporarily shielded them from the worst of the current's fury. Jimmy clutched the cooler to his chest, trembling violently as cold water seeped through his waders. "That was too close," he gasped. Marco, grabbing blankets and dry rations, leaned across Carter to throw them to Jimmy. "We need to get off this water now," he said. Carter nodded, eyes fixed on the widening eddy. "There's a ledge just over there," he said, pointing toward the river's near bank, where a sloping rock face jutted above the water. "We can beach the boat and hike up to higher ground if we move now." With a final nod, he pushed the throttle forward, and they coasted along the riverbank toward the ledge, branches whipping past, spray stinging their faces as they fought the lingering current. Outside, the storm's intensity reached its peak. Mountain clouds boiled overhead, unleashing torrents of rain that mixed with the thawing snow, sending massive walls of water surging downstream. Within 20 minutes, the river had transformed from a placid springtime stream into a mountainous cascade of frothing whitewater that roared like a living beast. Lightning forked through the black sky, illuminating the jagged peaks that framed the river's corridor. Each flash revealed new debris, sodden logs, uprooted stumps, and entire sections of undercut banks collapsing into the foaming current. The river rose alarmingly fast, swelling over the ledge that had once provided safe passage. Carter skidded the boat sideways, grappling with the wheel as the river thrust them toward the shoreline. With a final lurch, the bow ground onto the rocky ledge, and Carter cut the engine. He leaped from the boat onto the slick rocks, propping a hand under Jimmy's armpit to help him stand. "Let's go!" Carter shouted, voice nearly lost in the storm's roar. They grabbed their packs, leaving fishing rods to swing loose in the boat's stern. The cooler, heavily iced, slid from Jimmy's grasp and tumbled into the churning water, lost forever. Carter, Jimmy, and Marco scrambled up the slippery rock face, braving freezing sheets of rain that drove into their faces like needles. Their boots slid on slick stone, and each step was a precarious gamble against the current's hunger. Eventually, they reached a narrow shelf where a steep trail of tangled tree roots and scree edged up the hillside toward drier ground. Exhausted, they climbed, the wind snapping their hooded jackets around their faces, rain plastering their hair to their skulls. The mountain's vertical gait challenged the last of their strength as the flooding waters lapped at the base of the slope hundreds of feet below. After 15 harrowing minutes, they reached a knoll where the hemlocks and firs thinned, and the rain, this far above the river, felt more like a heavy mist than a storm. They paused, gasping for air, as Marco checked his compass and phone. No signal. Carter struck a hand drill into sawed logs to start a smoky signal fire. Jimmy, shivering violently, huddled beneath a pine, sipping warm tea that Carter had insisted they carry in a thermos. With their teeth chattering and limbs numb, they knew they could not stay where they were. The mountainside above was prone to avalanches now that the snowpack had been eroded by rain. They needed to descend to a known safe zone, a small ranger outpost 2 miles down the slope, near Silver Pine Lake's northern inlet. Visibility was poor, but they recognized the features from Carter's mental map. A prominent boulder field that led to a hunter's shack, then a steeper descent to the Forest Service road that ran alongside the lake's edge. If they could reach the ranger station before nightfall, they might avoid hypothermia and flash flooding from downstream tributaries. Night fell in an inky hush, punctuated only by the distant roar of the river far below. The signal fire was damp, sending only a wisp of smoke that hovered above the tree line. Carter and Marco agreed to take turns keeping watch, feeding small kindling into the embers, so the smoke plume remained visible to any rescue helicopter that might pass overhead. Jimmy, free from the immediate chaos of the river, lay huddled beneath several layers of blankets, eyes half closed but restless in feverish shivers. Carter knelt beside him, pressing a cup of hot broth to his lips. "Drink," he urged. "We'll get help soon." Jimmy's teeth rattled against his teeth as he sipped. "Thank you," he choked out, voice hoarse. Carter nodded, heart heavy with the knowledge that Jimmy's condition might worsen during the long night. Above them, the storm abated into a steady drizzle, and the moon, momentarily freed from the cloud's chokehold, cast a pale glow across the misty treetops. As Carter kept the watch, he thought of the fabled Silver Pine Ranger Station, a cluster of log buildings sealed beneath metal roofs, stocked with emergency rations, and staffed by intrepid rangers who braved these mountains year-round. Now that station sat alone in the dark, the roar of its radio crackling with storm updates, but devoid of any signal from their distress call. Carter clenched his jaw. Their only hope lay in completing the descent before Jimmy's strength failed entirely. The dawn, gray and relentless, found them emerging from the hemlock stand onto a small plateau, where frost crystals glistened like diamonds on snow-dusted grass. The plateau sloped downward in a gentle riding that promised a more navigable passage to lower terrain. Carter consulted his compass. They faced east, toward Silver Pine Lake and the ranger station. Below, he could hear the river's roar, a distant 20 stories beneath. He led his friends down a creek bed trickling with milky glacial runoff. The trickle turned to a stream that raced through boulders, so they crossed carefully, skipping from stone to stone to avoid soaking their boots. Each step felt precarious. If they slipped, they risked plunging into water so frigid it could set off hypothermia within minutes. After an hour of cautious descent, they found the hunter's shack, a small structure of reclaimed wood, its door latched against the storm. Carter tried the latch. It held tight, as though the building's previous occupant had anticipated the worst. They knocked loudly. "Anyone here?" Carter called, pounding on the door with an upturned boot. Inside, silence. Carter opened the door and pushed in. A cold draft hit them, revealing a dusty kerosene lamp perched on a rickety table, a cast-iron stove with a funnel chimney leading up through the roof, and empty shelves where jars of preserved meats might once have been. No one had been here in months, perhaps since the last winter storm. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them. Jimmy collapsed onto the bare wooden floor, shivering uncontrollably. Carter slid the thermos of hot water from his pack, though any warmth was fleeting in the cold shack. Meanwhile, Marco propped the door open and shoved chairs beneath the door to prop it in place against the wind. The trio knew they could not linger. They needed to continue to the ranger station, now only a mile down the logging road. Gathering their strength, they braced the floor with their bodies, using the shack's remnants as a windbreak, while Carter tied a makeshift litter from an old tarp and 2 sturdy branches he found piled near the shack's back wall, likely left by Trappers to Drag Game. They strapped Jimmy onto the litter, bundling him in blankets, and tested the device by lifting one end at a time to ensure it would not collapse under weight. Outside, The drizzle had turned to a fine snow, adding a fresh dusting over the hunter's shack's roof. Carter gave Jimmy's shoulder a steadying hand. "Stay awake if you can," he urged. "We're almost there. You'll be warm soon." Jimmy nodded weakly, lips moving to form words but unable to speak. With careful teamwork, Carter, Marco, and later a struggling Jimmy, each taking turns to share the load temporarily, carried the litter down a narrow trail that connected to the Forest Service Road. Their boots crunched against freshly fallen snow as they emerged onto the road. A ribbon of bare gravel now obscured by half an inch of powder, they could see the faint glow of the ranger station's porch light a mile to the southeast, beacons of safety in the desolate white world. The rescue helicopter soared overhead for the third time that day, its spotlight sweeping over the frozen lake and reflecting off the snow like a searchlight of hope. The crimson and white of the helicopter's skis made a vivid dot against the white canvas. As the men approached, Carter waved his arms and shouted, "Up here! Over here!" The rotor wash ripped through the pines, sending a fan of swirling snow around them. The helicopter descended with practiced precision, its body swaying as wind whipped around the mountain peaks. Two medics leaped out, bundled in Arctic gear, each carrying insulated stretchers and medical packs. Carter and Marco lifted Jimmy from the makeshift litter, placing him gently onto the medic's thermal blanket-wrapped board. The dying man's lips had turned brittle white, and his breaths came in shuddering gasps. The medic clamped on ice-resistant pulse and oxygen monitors, while the other medic injected a warming saline solution through an IV line. Carter and Marco knelt beside them as the helicopter's heat washed over his face. Jimmy's fingers twitched, and he opened his eyes to look at his friends. "Thanks," he whispered into the cold air, voice trembling with relief as they lifted the gurney into the helicopter. Carter, heart pounding, hugged Lily's woolen sock, a memento Jimmy always kept in his pocket to remember home, and watched as the helicopter rose into the swirling gray sky. With the last whump of rotor blades, the helicopter vanished into the storm's churn, leaving Carter and Marco alone on the narrow road. They looked at each other, both shaken yet grateful that Jimmy had survived. But they had one more task, to get themselves out before darkness fell and the storm worsened. Carter checked his compass one last time. They still had 3 miles to walk to the ranger station. The first miles passed in solemn silence, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the hollow echo of the river's roar drifting up from below. Above them, the sky had begun to lighten with the promise of dawn, though thick clouds still obscured the sun. Their heads ached with frost and fatigue, but hope burned in their chest. They would reach safety and then rejoin their friend on his path to recovery. At the ranger station, a squat log building with a flared metal roof shaped to shed snow like a warrior's helm, Thomas Mitchell, the head ranger, greeted them with steaming cups of cocoa. He carried their packs inside to the main room lit by a blazing wood stove that crackled and popped. The warmth hit them like a wave, igniting tears in their frost-chapped eyes. Thomas sat Carter and Marco at a rough-hewn pine table, offering thick blankets and hot soup. He patted Carter's arm. "You two made it," he said, voice low and full of relief. "Jimmy's stable and will be airlifted to Pinecrest Medical Center within the hour." "Those medics work miracles in storms." Carter exhaled in gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "That wolf's howl saved Jimmy's life." Thomas nodded and raised a cup. "To the wolf," he said, and they clinked mugs in solemn thanks. In the days that followed, Jimmy regained strength, his resiliency fueled by nutritious meals and frequent warmth. Carter and Marco remained at the ranger station, helping with emergency communication and repairing the hunter's shack's signposts. Each day at dawn, the three friends hiked to the river's edge, examining driftwood to ensure no hikers had planked into the churning current. By the end of the week, Jimmy, though still weak, rejoined Carter and Marco at Mary's Meadow for a final homage to the wolf that had guided their rescue. They set up a small memorial, a ring of stones atop a stone cairn near the river's bank, and placed a simple plaque etched with a wolf's silhouette and the words, "In honor of the lone wolf's howl that guided search teams to the Dawson family, March 3, 2025. They each laid a small pine cone at the cairn's base. By spring's thaw, the legend of the rescue spread through Pinecrest and the surrounding mountain communities. Winter hunters and backcountry guides spoke in earnest tones of the ghostly howl that echoed across the Blackwood Mountains, leading rescuers to the stranded family in the heart of the blizzard. A local wildlife photographer captured a haunting image, a lone gray wolf standing on a snow-blasted boulder, head tilted skyward, caught mid-howl as snow swirled like confetti around it. The photo appeared in regional newspapers and became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibit on mountain rescue and coexistence with wildlife. It carried the title, Guardian of the Storm: How a Lone Wolf's Call Saved 4 Lives. Inspired by the story, Pinecrest Search and Rescue instituted a Wolf's Vigil program. Recruits learned to interpret wolf calls in winter, understanding that when a lone howl occurs amid a blizzard, it may not be a territorial call, but a guiding beacon. Bear, Clara Nguyen's Malamute, earned a medal for his part in tracking the wolf's cry, and local schools incorporated the story into lessons on wildlife ecology and emergency preparedness. Months later, as the next winter's first snow began to dust the mountains, Carter and Marco hiked to the river's edge at Mary's Meadow with Lily and Sam in tow. Jimmy having moved to a hiking resort with his parents to regain strength. Around the cairn, they placed fresh wildflowers, snow violets, pink fireweed, and bright yellow wintergreens. Lily slipped a small laminated photo of the wolf, autographed by the photographer, into a crevice. "So this cairn always knows you visited, Wolf," she whispered. The children giggled as they watched the wolf's silhouette, etched in stone, oversee the river below. As the wind began to pick up, snow teased the treetops, and Carter felt a distant, haunting howl drift down the river's corridor, sliding smoothly over ice and wood. It was a single note, resonating deep in the wind, a reminder that they were never truly alone in the mountains, that the wild's guardians watched from the shadows, guiding lost souls to safety. Carter wrapped an arm around Jimmy and lifted his chin so he could hear. "Listen," he said. Jimmy closed his eyes, face peaceful, as the faint howl carried upward. For a moment, everything else fell away. Fear, the storm, the frigid cold. It was only the sound of the wolf's cry echoing across the range, a timeless promise that help will come when needed, even from the most unexpected of heroes. And in that solemn moment, they felt the true bond between human and wild, forged in adversity and sealed by gratitude, a bond woven into the very fabric of the Blackwood Mountains, carrying their story in echoes far beyond the roaring river's banks.